It's astonishing, isn't it, that in the 15 years of my life in Uganda, I never stepped into an African home.
Namaste and welcome to another episode of Expulsion at 50. My name is Dola Vasani. Back in 1972, President Idi Amin ordered all Asians to leave the country within 90 days. Most went to the United Kingdom as refugees, while others ended up in Canada, Kenya, India, the United States, Australia, and various countries in Europe. In this podcast series, I've had the privilege of speaking to many different people. They've all shared their heartfelt and personal stories of growing up in Uganda, the experiences of the 90 days, and their arrival and life in a new land. In August 2020, I had the pleasure of speaking to Raju, a family friend from his home in London. I hope you enjoy listening to his story.
My parents were, in a sense, refugees from the extended family in India. They weren't part of the stream, part of that population of Asians in Uganda who had been there for generations. They were relatively latecomers. That's two sisters, three brothers, really a nuclear unit. There weren't relatives around us in Uganda or East Africa. It was quite a plain living, in the sense that my parents didn't have any property in the country or elsewhere. My father was an orphan at a very early age, and so he had been brought up by his brother, who was 20 years older than him. And his brother was the reason why my dad came to Uganda, because his brother was engaged in the cotton business. And you're talking about the 20s now, and you're talking about Indian capital at that time. Narandas Rajaram was an Indian multinational company. A job opportunity came up in Uganda under the same umbrella of that multinational company. It must have been quite a courageous thing to do, coming into the unknown. It must have been quite extraordinary as well, if you think about it. He would have arrived in Mombasa in 1950, a couple of years after the marriage, and his job was as a delivery clerk. So it was to go from one cotton farm to another to measure the thread, the cotton thread, because that was a measure of the quality of the cotton. And that was the job. And the first few years, he would have driven around. He didn't know how to drive, so he would have had a driver. And there was this man called Habibu, who was with us in the end as well. So they obviously established a rapport. But they would have been driving from, one farm to another, not just in Uganda, but in Tanzania and Kenya as well. Short, eventually, he got a settled job in the office in Kampala, and then he was able to call Ben and Pina over. It must have been quite extraordinary for Ben as well, because she would have been 21, 22 years old, coming with this very, very young baby into this complete unknown. So he found another job with a firm called Cotton Distributors, and they found that flat in Century House, which was opposite the Houses of Parliament on the one side and the National Theatre on the other. And that's where I remember growing up. It was a flat, one of about 20 or 30 flats. and most of the occupiers were Asian. I think there was one Chinese family, and that was the Chinese family which ran Canton Restaurant underneath. And that balcony looked out. Opposite was La Bella nightclub, some of the nightclub music that I've grown to love. My Boy Lollipop was one of the songs that I remember flying across. And of course, there's the xylophone, the wooden, the indigenous instrument. The school that I went to was Shimoni School, which was, within walking distance. And in a class of 40, we would have had about 35 Asian kids, perhaps about 5 African. It was a lovely time in the sense that we seemed to be out most of the time in the school playing field. I remember the mogo we had in our break time, boiled mogo with milk. So it sounds horrible, but it was lovely at the time. So school sessions were from 7:30 in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we'd come home, have lunch, and very often we'd be back in the school field playing cricket for the rest of the afternoon. All of us growing up loved cricket. And the Pentangular tournament, I don't know whether you remember, was one of their big events. The teams involved in the Pentangular tournament were the Asians, and that was a term there which meant not just Indians, but Hindu Indians. Then there were the Muslims, right? Then there was the Goans, then the Africans, and their team was called the Africans, and then the Europeans. Now, this is post-independence Uganda. And the way we organized ourselves was still within, not just within the Asian community, but within these very ossified identities. Speaks to the kind of inward-looking communities we came from. It was the reality that our parents came with.
You mentioned the issue of segregation. Is it something that you would say you noticed then, or is it later on that you thought, oh God, when we lived there, this is how it was?
I can't pretend to have been aware of it then, but certainly having arrived here and the experiences here, and then I remember the library, of course. That was a good memory in behind the Houses of Parliament. It was an escape as well from the rest of that life, because the books on the shelves in that library, I'm not, at the time it seemed like an enormous selection. I think in reality it was quite a small library, but it was a real eye-opener, just finding my way through all kinds of literature. Remember reading David Copperfield books as well. It's a window into the outside world. Train journeys, they were fantastic. The train journey to Nairobi, where you got the 4 o'clock train from the station, and overnight in that second-class cabin with 6 bunks, and 7 of us managed to get in there sometimes. That was, you'd arrive in Nairobi the next morning, and if we were lucky, once or twice, I think, we carried on to Mombasa. But I loved those nights on the train, and I loved the train journey through the Rift Valley. I didn't say that those trains, they went so slow that one of my highlights of my life, because in 1971, Ben Kaka had sent Vikram and me to India on our own. It wasn't just on our own. It was a journey by train from Kampala to Mombasa, then a journey on SS Haryana in the third class across the Indian Ocean to Bombay. So it's a cargo ship, and the cargo is in the hold of the ship. And what they do is put a tarpaulin over all the cargo, and then around it, if you like, across the whole boat. If you think of a balcony, so in the circular balcony around the hold, they put bunk beds in. The only privacy was saris that had been hung up between bunks. And the most amazing sight where, the blue skies, blue sea, and these fish would just be flying out in front of us. But that was an amazing journey. And it was, again, prompted by what you said about innocence, because it was also an eye-opener being on our own. By the 70s, I was in Kololo Secondary School. Again, in a class of about 40, there were more black kids. I think there would have been about 10 black kids, but still predominantly Asian. We had, again, Asian teachers, including some real sadists and monsters. But we had African teachers as well as some white teachers, both from the UK and from the United States. But this was a guy who was a really strange specimen. But he introduced me to Mark Twain and Huck Finn and all that. And I still remember, the pleasure that I got from reading. And there was this beautiful, beautiful West African woman from Senegal who took us for French. Her French classes were always the best attended because all the boys wanted to be there. I mean, it was part of that, we're getting into our teens, we're growing up, and coming across African kids for the first time. I remember John. He was in my class, John Oketch, and he was a couple of years older than the rest of us. He was taller, but really gentle guy, really bright guy. And once, after bringing back homework from school, I wanted to see what he had done because I just wanted to make sure whatever I had done was right. And I looked at his book, and I could see that what he had been written over previous writing, which had been rubbed over. And I looked through the book, and that's what was happening all the way through. So I asked him, I was so stupid of me. But I said, why do you do this? And he just looked at me. And he said, because we can't afford to buy new books. And, for me, it was a real eye-opener because, we weren't rich. But, my parents could always afford to give me a new book and a new pencil.
I had a dream sent last night from God. He has instructed me to throw out all Asians from the country. Uganda must be for Ugandans only. The Asians were brought here by the colonialists to build railway. The railway is now finished. Let the British have the Asians and the Amin soldiers have their dukas. They have exploited Ugandan people. I give the Asians 90 days to pack up and go.
And, what I heard was also Kaka saying that this was nonsense. That it's yet another one of his dreams and it'll pass by. I think, as you will have heard from others, The conditions around the streets were getting more insecure as well. The roadblocks, the men in dark glasses, stories of people disappearing were becoming more frequent. And I remember the queues waiting for the passport to be sorted, the visas to be sorted, and that general air of tension. Some very, very reassuring voices around us at the time. Funnily enough, they were two company. The old man Habibu, whom he knew from when he first arrived, and then there was a younger guy called Wilson. And because of the roadblocks and everything else, they would make sure that they were around when my mum had to go anywhere.
To just ask you about this special relationship with Wilson and Habibu. How do you remember, for your dad, for you, for the rest of you, because of course these people were in your life, and then they're not.
And they were very much in our lives, as I say, they were very reassuring. They were in our lives, but remember, I never went to their home. So it was a very odd relationship. They were very, I trusted them, we trusted them in a way in which we probably didn't trust many other people.
Your parents had on them as sort of drivers, as guards, as guardians, as caretakers, but yeah. That was the sort of the boundary of it.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, there were boundaries. It never was allowed to evolve into a personal friendship, if you like. I'd never met their children. It was September, I think 20th or 21st September. They'd managed to get a flight. We had to go in a convoy to the airport because, again, of the roadblocks on the way. We go in, we're check in, and then as we're going through, Kaka's taken away. And then I think it must have been after we'd been there for a couple of hours. We see Kaka is coming to us. He's never talked about what happened there. I still, I never found out. And there was still so much tension because you didn't know what was going to happen. And it wasn't until the plane was in the air and heading towards Nairobi that, huge relief. We arrive at Heathrow, and the first sense I have is of the smell, which I couldn't believe. It was stale, and then just seeing these houses which all looked alike. It couldn't compute, why the fuck were all these houses looking so similar?
Raju's parents and two brothers elected not to go to a resettlement camp established to accommodate the refugees from Uganda. Instead, his sister Viba, who was already in Finchley, North London, studying, found an apartment to rent for the family.
Still only just turned 18, but she'd managed to rent a one-bedroom flat for us in Muswell Hill. This pokey little place. I remember it's September, end of September. remember turning on the telly and seeing colour telly for the first time. And I've still got this vivid memory of the news that evening. And one of the first items on this colour telly news is a demonstration by the Smithfield butchers against the Ugandan Asians being taken in. And a few days later, we had to go to see the head teacher at this school in Finchley. We were still living in Muswell Hill at the time, so it was a commute, bus and tube. So we had to learn that quite quickly within days, and all three of us arrived, and we're obviously looking a bit odd because we were dressed in the way we were from Kampala. So we hadn't yet got our school uniforms or anything. And we had been given our timetables and room numbers. And Vikram and Hemu find their room numbers quite quickly. And I'm walking up and down the corridor and I just can't find the fucking room. And then I see a man come out of a door. So I thought I'd go and ask him. So I went up to him, showed him the timetable and asked him where this room was. And I still remember him, a white guy, looking at me up and down, up and down. And then he says, "You're just going to have to find it yourself, aren't you?" And I carried on looking, and eventually, 5 minutes later, I do find the room, knock on the door, open it, and guess who the teacher is? It's that guy. Class of 30, about 20 Jewish kids. It's a boys' school, so 20 Jewish boys, about 5 Anglo-Saxon ish, and about 5 Asians and others. That was the kind of demography. And I still remember the maths teacher. He would, that time we still had the blackboards, and I remember him putting up a problem on the blackboard and then asking the class. And then he turns and says, "So let's see what the packies in the corner have to say about this." It was a learning curve, and for the first time, I had to learn how to fight physically. As soon as I entered the playground, I didn't know where the next knee between the legs was going to come from. You just need to be prepared. And it was quite a hostile welcome. Kaka is with us for a few weeks. And then he has to, the Swiss firm for whom he had been working in Kampala, they said they would give him a job in Lausanne in Switzerland. I can see why he did that. It would have, it was a job. It was a job he was with employers he was familiar with. But it wasn't easy for him either. But he was not the same man. In Kampala, he had been the patriarch. It's a truism, but it's the women who hold things together and men held things together. Although it was also an opportunity for us to grow up very, very quickly, because men couldn't speak English. And I remember trying to sort out electricity, gas, all of that. And, basic daily things like the shopping. And it also, in a way, turns the power relations on their head. So about a couple of years. And I think in the end, it was just too lonely. with what he had earned, we were also able to buy a house in Finchley.
Finding one's place in a new land was a meandering and at times a challenging path.
Trying to come to terms with who I am and we are, having come from there in the circumstances we did, trying to find ourselves in a sense. And that was very much part of that rocky journey through before university, through university, and afterward. I mean, Uganda, to answer your specific question, it was always there, but I didn't have either the inclination or the opportunity to go back until relatively recently, 2014. Key motivation was to show Pragna and my daughters the old haunts where we lived, where we went to school and all that, and also to revisit them for myself. The shock of coming out of Entebbe airport and that red earth. In fact, it's not even the airport, just coming out of the aeroplane and that lovely smell of the red earth. And it felt I wanted to just fill my lungs with that. And then the red earth as we drove out of Entebbe airport. And the shock of the development. I didn't realize it would be so developed, where virtually all of those 21 miles are now developed, whereas my memory of it is going through a forest. As we approach Kampala, I couldn't recognize the skyline. Heartbreaking to hear how a whole generation of people in Uganda had been wiped out, not just by Idi Amin, but by AIDS. And so the people we were meeting had heard about the expulsion, but hadn't been there themselves, which is an eye-opener. The friendliness of the people we were meeting at everywhere we went, real generosity and warmth of spirit.
Yeah, and I think, over the years, the Ugandan people have really been battered in all different ways, but they keep rising up. And they keep rising up today. If we think about the political situation, if I think about, LGBT communities and the activists there, the human rights defenders. So, I've done quite a bit of work in that area, and it's amazing how strong and vibrant the movement is. So Raju, what would you say are your main reflections and insights?
The expulsion was a completely arbitrary action, as was the rest of Idi Amin's raid. The atrocities he committed against the population in general just puts what happened to the Asians in perspective. It was a little drop in the ocean. What I was really hopeful for was the Constitutional Convention that was set up by Museveni after he took power. And I was really perhaps, with the luxury of distance, hoping against hope that that Constitutional Convention reflected a real deal, which would respect the rule of law. And it's not the rule of law for its own sake, but what it means in terms of the quality of life for all of us, for the ordinary human being. And it's disappointing to see that Constitutional Convention has, in a sense, if not eroded completely, if its fruits have not been eroded completely, then it's been corrupted. The way in which, certainly personally, it's opened up the world in a way in which I doubt it would have opened up for me or those around me. And hand in hand with that, I suppose, is that very inward-looking community we were in. But I think in terms of the minds as well, it's not just the geography which has opened up, but I'd like to think minds have been opened up as well, that I have been able to have the education that I had in the broadest sense here in London and UK. And by that, I'm not just talking about school and university. That was important. And to think that it was free is quite remarkable. And as I say to my girls, we have the privilege of being the children of 3 continents and prisoners of none.
If you would like to share your personal story for a future episode of Expulsion at 50, please get in touch. The email address is expulsion50@gmail.com or on Twitter @expulsion50. Till next time, take care and stay safe.